Making a terrarium can seem difficult and complicated if you've never made one before, but after watching this video, you'll learn exactly how to make your own. I'll be covering everything, from making the drainage layer, creating the substrate mix, picking out the right moss and plants and much more. I'm gonna start by picking out an appropriate container to build the terrarium in, although all of these would make great terrariums. Some will be a lot harder than others. This glass bottle, for instance, has a very tight, narrow opening. This makes it difficult to get any materials inside. That's not to say it can't be done. And long tweezers such as these will make the job possible, but it's definitely a lot harder and can most certainly test your patience. So for today's build, we're going to pass on these two containers here. Micro terrariums in glass bottles, such as this one, can be great fun to make. However, they can be quite fiddly and do require a little more maintenance for them to thrive. This is a glass spice jar. Making a terrarium in something like this is a great budget-friendly way to upcycle otherwise useless household items. I'm not using it today, but I've made one in the past if you want to check that video out. Another great option to use is something like a drinking glass. They're very affordable and come in lots of different shapes and sizes. However, unlike this jar, they obviously don't come with a lid. This is a quick and easy solve. By using something like a clear acrylic disc, they're very affordable and make great lids for terrariums. Here's a drinking glass terrarium I made 6 months ago, and as you can see, it's thriving. Although it would work great, I want to use something a little larger for today's beginner build. These 3 containers here would all make great terrariums. They all come with a lid, are easy to get materials inside, and they're a good size to start off with for today's build. I'm going to be using this glass cookie jar. I got it from IKEA, and it's roughly 2 liters in size. It has a lid with a rubber gasket, which will provide a tight seal. One important thing to point out before starting this build is the glass seam, although it's hard to see on camera. This is a line that goes down either side of the glass. Make sure you position these lines on the side so they don't block the front view. Now, I'm going to move on and start making the drainage layer. This is a layer of stones or rocks that will sit at the bottom of the terrarium, where excess water can sit. To make this layer, you have many options. This is pea gravel. It's very affordable and could be found at most garden centers and hardware stores. This is Leaker. It's a little more pricey, but it has the added benefit of being extremely light and porous. The most budget-friendly way is to simply find stones outside. This is just 3 examples, but when it comes to what you can use, your options are unlimited so long as the rocks and stones are relatively small in size. They would do a great job. These rocks here are obviously too big and would not make a suitable drainage layer. Although all 3 of these would work great for today's build, I'm going to be using Leaker. As I briefly mentioned earlier, it's very porous. This means each stone will be able to hold water, which will ultimately mean that there is a greater volume of drainage in the terrarium. It's also very light, which will keep the weight of the terrarium down. This comes in very handy in large terrariums. After pouring in a generous amount and passing it down into place, the drainage layer is complete for a terrarium this size. The drainage layer only needs to be about 2 to 3 centimeters. If I was to put the substrate in now, it would fall through all the gaps and cracks in the drainage layer. This is certainly not ideal, but there's a simple solution. This is window screen mesh, and I'm going to use it to create a substrate barrier. This will sit on top of the drainage layer and prevent the substrate from getting through. Obviously, it needs to be cut to size, which can easily be done with a pair of scissors. I place the terrarium on top of the window screen mesh, and then roughly cut out the shape. Then I take it and neaten it up a little bit. There are other materials you can use for a substrate barrier, such as weed block of fabric, but I found window screen mesh to work best. It holds the majority of the substrate back while still allowing a good flow of water. It hasn't got to be perfect, and can even work better. If it's cut a little bit too big, the substrate will have a hard time getting through the small holes with the drainage layer and substrate barrier in place. Let's move on to creating the substrate mix. I'm going to use my usual mix, which I've used to make over 2,000 successful terrariums. These are the materials you'll need. I'll explain the ratio as I make the mix. You'll also need a tub to mix everything up, and a tub to measure the parts. Let's get started. I'm going to start by taking the cocoa fiber brick and rehydrating it in water. Be aware that it does expand a lot. About 20 minutes later, it's fully hydrated and ready to add to the mix. I use the cup to measure out 1 part cocoa fiber. 1 part is simply whatever size cup you are using. 1/4 part will be 1/4 of the cup, and 2 parts will be 2 cups, obviously, as I mentioned. We only need 1 part cocoa fiber. I'm then going to measure out 2 parts sphagnum moss. As I make a lot of small terrariums, I like to trim up the sphagnum moss into small pieces. This is easily done with scissors. I then add 1/4 part of orchid bark, 1/4 part of charcoal, and 1/4 part of worm castings, and then I mix them up all together. Here's all the ratios up on screen if you want to take a screenshot. All the components come together to make the perfect terrarium substrate. It holds moisture, is resistant to compression, contains nutrients for the plants and is well draining. These are all key characteristics of a quality terrarium substrate. If you, like me, and make a lot of terrariums, why not make a big batch time to get the substrate into the terrarium? I use a cup to pour in a generous amount of substrate. If you're enjoying this build or finding it useful, why not drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss any few